Great, thanks. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here in North Carolina. Absolutely delighted that the state has joined with other states to study the issue of retirement readiness and to look at options to strengthen retirement savings and security. As Lisa, as part of the introduction, explained at the Georgetown Center, we were established to help advance state-facilitated retirement savings plans. We have prided ourselves on creating what we believe and have tried to create the go-to for states. So we have a network that we facilitate, a monthly convening of states. We have a state resource center. We're delighted and hope to plug North Carolina into all of that to save the work of the task force some time, not reinventing the wheel. There's a lot of great things that have already been done, so we look forward to partnering with North Carolina on that as we move forward. So, again, to set the stage of the challenges, and again, the treasurer talked about this a little bit, the previous panel talked about this a little bit, but we're really at a point today with respect to our retirement system that needs to give us pause and attention. As Treasurer Falwell had mentioned, we're living longer. The reality is the demographic trends that we are facing with regards to an aging population are quite serious. We have a population that is going to be growing older. Today, there are 10,000 Americans that are turning 65 every day. Today, if you're 65 years old, you're expected to live at least to age 85, if not longer. Again, the treasurer mentioned that, what the consequences are on the public sector side with respect to public pensions. But again, overall, the consequences, not just on the public sector side, but also private sector and workers today in the private sector and what they face in their ability to save for retirement, given that they are going to live longer. The reality is, if you're a 10-year-old today, for those of you who have small children, the likelihood they're going to live to 100 is significant. So again, we're looking at people. If you're going to be working, again, the treasurer, excellent point. If you're going to work for 20, 30, 40 years, how, during those 20, 30, 40 years, do you save? You have to pay for everything during that time. You're raising a family, you're putting kids through college, you need to save for retirement. How are you going to work for 20, 30, 40 years, but then save for an additional 20, 30 years of retirement income once you stop working? Low levels of financial literacy. Again, something the treasurer touched upon. We have a lot of studies that are done. A particularly great resource is George Washington University's Center for Financial Literacy. Professor Anna Maria Lusardi does a tremendous amount of work on this issue. The reality is the levels of understanding basic financial concepts is incredibly low. It's a problem not just in the United States, it's a problem around the world. And so as we look in terms of the private sector and people having to make decisions about whether to save, how much to save, how to make it last, if we're not very strong with respect to grasping basic concepts like the power of compound interest, and what that means with regards to you need to start saving earlier, time is on your side if you do that, it makes it more challenging with respect to retirement savings. The lack of access, The next is again, shifting complex decisions to individuals. So as we've moved from a system of defined benefit, the good old-fashioned traditional pension plans, towards a system of defined contribution. So most plans today in the private sector are defined contribution savings plans. So those days of, again, most DB plans that you see today, most of them are in the private sector. There are some still in terms of large companies in the private sector, but again, more often defined contribution is predominant in the private sector. Those days of getting that pension check after working for a company for 30, 40 years has been going away. The reality is, as we moved from a defined benefit world to a defined contribution savings world, what does that mean? We've shifted all of the complex financial decisions with regards to planning for retirement to the individual. So again, the individual takes on all of that responsibility to decide, am I going to save? If I am going to save, how much do I need to save? How long do I need to save? And then when the day comes when I stop working, how am I going to manage that money to last a lifetime? Lack of access to savings and behavioral inertia. This particular point is the reason why it's great that North Carolina has launched this task force and why so many other states around the country, we have only 7 states, so 43 states North Carolina is now one of them because has chosen to study this issue, that over the past few years has chosen to look at the issue of retirement readiness. And why is that? In the private sector today, more than half of the private sector workforce lacks access to a way to save. So again, we can talk about what's happening with respect to public sector and public pensions, and that is a challenge and there are issues to be confronted. But we have a situation with regards to the private sector workforce where we have workers who go to work every day today. They work for employers who do not offer them access to a way to save for retirement. And again, I'm sure Sarah and others have mentioned, we've heard that if they have a way to save through their employer, they're significantly more likely to save for their retirement. People will say, well, gosh, why do we need to look at state-facilitated retirement savings plans? You have Fidelity, you have Schwab, you have all these folks out there. People can just go open a retirement account. Again, as you've already heard, and I will only underscore, behaviorally, and I think we'll hear from our folks at Duke, people don't always act in their best interests. There's inertia to be overcome. These human nature and behavioral issues. The reality is they can go down the street and open an IRA. The reality is very few do that. And so we have these behavioral issues that are the reality, compounding the fact that they don't even have access to a way to save through an employer-sponsored retirement savings plan. Some of the challenges that we're looking as we go forward. Millennials are struggling today. Millennials are our economic future. If we're looking forward and wanting to see, with respect to the strengthening of our economy, continued economic growth, millennials will play an important role in that. The reality is millennials today are carrying huge amounts of debt. 2/3 of millennial workers today are saving nothing for retirement. So there are things, they have issues around lack of access to ways to save. They're not saving. Part of the reason they're not saving is because they're over-indebted. Millennials today are earning a little bit less on average than millennials from 10 years ago. These are the generation that came out of the Great Recession a decade ago. So millennials are facing significant challenges, and we're going to need to address those millennial challenges that are essentially robbing their ability to save for retirement. And the reality is, if we don't, we're going to be facing slower economic growth. We're going to be facing slower economic growth for a variety of reasons as we go forward. We're going to be facing it because of an aging population, fewer workers. So if we continue to talk about what the cost is to government, there are so many different ways that there are consequences to federal, state, and local budgets. With an aging population, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, energy assistance programs. So the consequences for the federal budgets, for state and local budgets are enormous. And as the population ages, the demands for those programs will only grow if we have an aging population that stops working and has insufficient retirement income. And again, the millennials are going to be the key to addressing and offsetting that. But again, our millennials are struggling. So unless we come up with ways to help not only the millennials, but younger generations, then we will forever be looking, going forward, to slower rates of economic growth than we've seen in the past. And layer on top of that, how do you also offset that? Productivity increases. But I think there are a lot of folks that do not anticipate that we're going to be able to continue to see the significant productivity gains, technology or otherwise, that we've necessarily seen in the past. So again, the aging of the population, slower economic growth, not being able to have the productivity gains to necessarily offset that. Millennials are going to be key to dealing with that. If we don't address the struggles millennials are facing, then again, what that means is slower economic growth as we move forward. And again, as I mentioned, lack of savings overall. We have to address this issue. It's facing our younger generations. It's already a challenge for those who are at or near retirement, and I'll get to some of those statistics in a minute. And again, the strain on government resources that we face will be enormous. Unprepared for retirement, that's the bottom line. As I mentioned, the shift from the defined benefit to defined contribution landscape, people are simply not saving in the private sector enough for retirement. Half of the workforce lacks access, and the reality is, also in the bigger picture, so we work on state-facilitated retirement savings plans to deal with closing the coverage and the access issues. But this is a much bigger issue. We need to look at the entire retirement system. When we talk about retirement savings, we're talking about the input into the retirement system. We've been focused, and the defined contribution system was never set up to be the sole retirement the sole way to save for retirement. It was intended to be a supplement to defined benefit. That's not how it's turned out. And so as we've focused on people putting money into the system and saving and on wealth accumulation, what we have failed to do is recognize that we're not focused on the outcomes. Why are we asking people to save? What is the purpose of having that money in the account? The purpose of having that money in the account is for retirement. What does that mean? If they take that money out and in 5 years spend it all, and then have to rely on programs at the federal, state, and local level, then we've not been successful in strengthening retirement security. We cannot focus simply on input to the system, savings into the system. We have to focus on helping our workers not only save enough, but when the day comes and they stop working, helping them, it doesn't stop at that point. So they've accumulated, we have to help them in decumulation. Decumulation is lifetime income. How do we take those attributes of a defined benefit world, which is that guaranteed monthly check that people count on after they retire? What do we do in a defined contribution system? How do we replicate that? How do we bring that concept over into the defined contribution world that we're increasingly saving with? And so lifetime income is important. If we're truly focused on strengthening retirement well-being, retirement security in the long term, it's not just what people are putting into and accumulating wealth, but are we helping them manage that income to last through retirement? And again, if you're looking at categories, folks that are at or near retirement, millennials and women, the picture just isn't very good. The median amount of savings for households 55 and older was just $109,000 in 2015. Again, when people think, you focus on the account balance doesn't tell you how secure you're going to be in retirement. People will focus on, to a lot of people, $100,000 sounds like a lot of money. If you tell them what that's going to come to a monthly income over 20, 30 years, and it's just a couple $100s, that's a totally different picture. And so, again, most households already, near retirement have not saved nearly enough. 55% of households 55 to 64 have less than $25,000 in retirement savings. A third have neither defined benefit plans or retirement savings. A third that are at or near retirement have neither type of savings. And what's also scary is we've talked about millennials and student loan debt. The fastest growing age group for student loan debt are those over the age of 75. People are now today going into retirement with significant amounts of mortgage debt, significant amounts of consumer debt, and over the age of 50, into their 60s, into their 70s, are carrying student loan debt. Because our student loan system has allowed increasingly for parents and others to co-sign those loans, and then unfortunately, they find themselves picking up that debt. And guess what? Social Security garnishes Social Security benefits for failure to pay on student loans. And we've had over 100,000 Americans who've had Social Security garnished for failure to pay student loans. For millennials, as I said, 66% of workers have nothing saved for retirement. We have to address this. And again, how student loan debt robs the younger generations. Those entering the workforce with $30,000 in student loan debt risk ending up with $325,000 less in retirement. The average student loan debt was $33,000. So again, what are the things that are confronting families today, workers today, that are robbing them of their ability to pay for retirement? There's a lot of great work that's being done to deal with the larger financial family picture, things like helping workers with emergency savings, having the flexibility to get funds to address emergency issues. Employers are starting to get creative with respect to attracting workers by helping them address student loan debt. These are all different kinds of initiatives that are extremely important to helping stop robbing our workers today of their ability to save for retirement. For women, it's not a pretty picture either. They account for 47% of the workforce, almost half, but about 2/3 of the women in the workforce are part-time workers. And guess what? Usually if you're a part-time worker, you're probably not going to have access to retirement benefits. And not surprisingly, we've talked about longevity. Women tend to outlive men, and nearly half of elderly unmarried women receive who get Social Security rely on it for more than 50% of their income, compared to 22% for all seniors. So we already have a significant proportion of our retired workers today, our retirees, who are heavily dependent on Social Security. So again, as we move forward, if we're not able to address the issues. Again, increasingly, workers who have lived under a defined contribution system, not a pension system, not a defined benefit, they've not had one either in the public sector or the private sector, will increasingly come to rely more on Social Security as their sole source of income as we go forward. It's not a great picture. And what does it mean for the states? What does it mean for government? As I said, nearly a quarter of today's 65-year-olds are going to live past the age of 90, according to the Social Security Administration. Today's 10-year-olds are expected to live to 104, according to the World Economic Forum. California would save $1.4 billion. Now, this gets to the point about, is it worth saving even a little bit? The answer is yes. I've had students ask me, should I save $25? The answer is yes. Put that $25 away. It might be a week, put it away a month, but put it away. California would save $1 billion on public assistance programs over about a 14-year period if lower-income retirees save enough to increase their retirement income by just $1,000 per year. It makes a difference. If a 25-year-old starts saving a little bit of money and saves from age 25 to 45, and then stops saving, and lets that money sit there until age 65, so that's 40 years. Someone doesn't start saving until age 45, saves for 20 years, from 45 to 65, guess who's going to have more money when they stop working at 65? The 25-year-old who saved from 25 to 45 and then stopped saving, versus the person who didn't start saving until they were 45 years old. So the power of compounding and time is on your side. You've got to start saving. Even if it's a little bit, it makes a difference, and the sooner you do it, the better. So every bit matters. So lower income retirees absolutely want to save for their retirement. And you cannot, and I've seen it in these state facilitated programs, the power, the psychological power of them seeing statements where they have started to put away a few $100s and what that means to them of having that opportunity. It is significant. The Pennsylvania Treasurer did a study, and I would highly recommend it. You can find it through the Georgetown Center. Happy to connect folks. We are at cri.georgetown.edu. Did a study where they invested with an economic consulting firm to look at the costs of the state. And again, it's significant. The difference in state assistance costs for elderly residents from insufficient savings will grow from $700 million in 2015 to $1.1 billion in 2030. And over a 15-year period, it adds up to an additional $14 billion just to the state of Pennsylvania. And there's a significant loss of consumer spending. Obviously, if people are aging into poverty, they don't have money to spend and put into the economy. So again, there's significant loss in terms of economic output to the state from that loss of income and the ability to spend. Okay, so with all of that cheery news, states, you're it. You've been leading the way from crisis to opportunity. We're counting on you. The Georgetown Center will start with a mission to help advance state initiatives. Why? The federal government hasn't stepped up to address this issue in any significant way. States understand the challenges. States understand the impact on their budgets and their programs. They're leading the way. They are laboratories of democracy. We encourage states to move forward and address this in the absence of action being taken by the federal government. Look to the states. You're driving change. You're designing simple, low-cost, easily accessible ways to save. And you're going to help expand access, coverage, and improve long-term retirement income outcomes. Congratulations, North Carolina. You're not in this group anymore. You have a task force. You're studying this issue. Only 7 states, and actually I can pull out Idaho. They didn't do something legislatively. They're doing it more administratively. They're studying it as well. I guess Florida, I can understand. There are a lot of retirees. Maybe they don't feel like they need to because the retirees are coming to their state. But again, 43 states have considered or enacted private sector retirement initiatives. Only 7 states haven't done anything. So what are they doing? There are 11 new programs, 10 states and 1 city. Yeah. It went away. It's telling me, stop talking, Angela. So we have 11 new programs, 10 states and 1 city, 4 models. Most of the models, as you can see, most of the states are on the left side, are adopting an auto IRA approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So the trend is towards an auto IRA, individual retirement account type model. We also have a voluntary payroll deduction IRA, so again, another state in that category. So the reality is we have 3 states that don't have some kind of IRA model. Marketplace, actually Washington State is there, but the trend, as I will show you in a minute, is away from marketplaces. Washington State doesn't want to be in that bucket. Washington State wants to be in the auto IRA, and they're going to work very hard legislatively to get themselves out of that bucket and into an IRA program. And then we have a couple of states that have multiple employer type arrangements, and I'll talk about those in a minute. In the 2019 legislative session, 24 states introduced different kinds of bills. Auto IRAs, secure choice model, and it's probably hard for you to, oh, well, good, you can see, hopefully. So green means the program's launched, yellow means they're in implementation planning mode, red means they have programs, but they really haven't started to be active in terms of implementation. So in terms of the auto IRA model, these are sort of the characteristics of the model. But basically what an auto IRA program is the state facilitating employers offering their workers access to put money into an IRA. And generally it is a Roth IRA that we see as the model that's chosen. But again, generally there's a board that's created, there's the use, people are auto-enrolled, and the option to opt out. So again, the state is requiring generally that employers offer their workers access to a way to save. Okay, what does that mean really? There's the state facilitated options and IRAs that they contract with the private sector to offer IRAs to workers to save. But the requirement is that employers offer access to a way to save. So employers also can simply choose to go out in the private market and set up their own plan. They could set up a 401k, they could set up a simple IRA, they could set up a type of program on their own. But if they choose not to do that, then the state facilitated program is there for them to use. And what we've seen in some states is that some small businesses have said, okay, we now in California, Illinois, and Oregon need to facilitate access and give our workers access to a way to save, give them the opportunity to save. So we'll go out and adopt a plan. And then others a lot of them are going through the state facilitated program. But again, for employees, it's always voluntary, so they can opt out. And again, generally what we're seeing in terms of participation data in California, Illinois, and Oregon, which are the first 3 states to actually launch and have workers enrolling, is generally about 31 to 35% opt-out rate, which is it's basically within sort of the expected range and what we've seen in other programs internationally. So this is not a great surprise or any shock, and it's kind of what people expected. So it's within the range of expectations. Auto escalation, the programs also allow for auto escalation for about 1% increase per year, and the increases, I think, in California is, I think, to 8%, in Oregon it's 10%, and Lisa and Andrea and others can get into more of those details. Employer contributions are not permitted, as is the case, with IRAs, and if it did, it would trigger ERISA. So in the use of an auto IRA model, employer contributions currently are not allowed. There's a limited set of investment options that are provided. Generally, the default is a target date fund, and then they provide other types of funds, a bond fund, equity fund, so on. There are caps on fees. It ranges from about 50 to 105 basis points, depending on the state. These I refer to them as public-private partnerships. I believe that they are. The states are entering into multi-year contracts with vendors. The vendors are assuming a lot of the upfront costs and risks, quite honestly, in setting up these programs at the state level. The states, in terms of the investment of state dollars to get these programs off the ground, has been quite minimal, generally in the $750,000 to $1.5 million range, that money having to be paid back once the program is fiscally sustainable. There have been pilot tests. They get pilot tested prior to rollout. Programs launch in waves based on employer size. And again, ultimately, independent and gig workers are also able to take advantage of these programs. Again, the default options in these, generally 5%. Something to keep in mind. When a lot of these programs started, they set it at 3%. John and Pew and others, Center for Retirement Research, Boston College, went out and talked to folks. They were very comfortable with higher default rates, closer to 5 or 6%, and guess what? The states adjusted it, moved it upward. That benefits the worker, and as we've seen, they're contributing in the 5 to 5.5% range. And again, Roth IRAs is the default, and the target date funds are the defaults that are set up in these systems. These programs, again, rolling out in waves over time. The third panel will get into a lot of this in more detail. Again, the employer perspective. What I will say is that there's overwhelming public support. In Oregon, the support has only grown for Oregon Saves as it's launched, as it started its implementation in 2017, enrolling workers. Small businesses want to help their workers save. They find it a great way. It actually, for them, helps to level the playing field when they compete for talent. The large firms offer retirement plans. This is a way that they can do that as well. Thousands of workers are saving, many for the first time. I thought you guys might find it interesting to hear it right from an employer. If I can get let me get the audio. Get the audio on. Okay, why isn't this audio? I know, I'm trying to get it open.
And it's been a big source of anxiety for me for a long time.
Let me get this.
It's something we've looked at every year. Honestly, every year for the last 10 years, we had a financial advisor from the private sector come and present to our team. We wanted them to save. And the truth is, people would be excited and meeting, and then they wouldn't take action. That's fine. Oregon Saves is the opt-out program. Everybody's opted in, and they have to choose to opt out. And what happened was amazing. We made it really easy for the staff, or Oregon Saves made it easy for the staff, and everybody who didn't have something on their own did not opt out. What I found was my staff would sit in that meeting and think, wow, yeah, I need to save for retirement. But what happened was they'd leave the meeting and they felt dumb. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to say. They didn't really want to meet with a financial advisor. They felt like they didn't know what was going on. When they did sit down with someone, they were talking about all these big goals that no one has ever talked to them about before. And so when we gave them none of that, all they had to do was not do anything, they were like, oh, this is great. And the feedback was like, oh, this is so fun and easy. The people that were opting or finding their own were only putting like $50 a month into their Roths, and now they're putting hundreds of dollars into their Roths. To date, my team has saved $67,000 in their retirement. It was easy for me as an owner too. I mean, the setup took me an hour, and I spent probably 15 minutes once a month to make, to new staff to add them to the list. It's been a very, very simple process for me. I couldn't be more pleased. And it's obviously very affordable because there is no cost for me as the employer. And that is an amazing thing. And what's so cool is as my company grows and we need different, better, bigger, badder options, there's no consequence for me to implement a 401k. There's no consequence for me to put something else in place for my team. So I'm obviously a big fan. I'm a big supporter. I think this is like the perfect harmony between government and private sector, right? Like they're working together to create this opportunity. My staff could leave the company and keep their money. I don't have to do anything logistically. The average income in my salon is $50,000. These are normal people that didn't go to college, that don't have a big investment acumen, and it's important that we create a tool to let them tap into this.
Okay. Well, I hope that helped. I'm going to turn this off. I'll get this going again. But I hope it helped to hear from an employer in Oregon, and you'll hear, again, more about these programs from others. So I hope that was helpful. But again, you see the enthusiasm, and Luke testified for the House Ways and Means Committee to talk about this, as has Treasurer Tobias Reed. So Washington has taken notice of what's happening in the innovation in the states. Let me quickly move on to explain the other options. So open multiple employer plans are a little bit different than the IRAs. So they're 401k ERISA plans, similarly done with state oversight. Now, ERISA requires voluntary participation. That's just part of the way the law is by design. It does allow for auto-enrollment with opt-out. There's opportunities for employers to offer matching contributions, which is an advantage of a 401, being able to offer a 401k. Again, default contributions at about 6% and auto escalation. So that's what we see in Mass, which has a small MEP for nonprofit organizations. And fees, again, expected to be very low. Multi-year contracts to reduce costs. Vermont is in the process of launching its MEP in the state of Vermont. So Mass and Vermont have the MEP models. And again, the marketplace model, which I mentioned, the trend is away from the marketplace. New Jersey left the marketplace and has now created a secure choice program, the auto IRA model. Washington State wants to do the same. The city of Seattle passed an auto IRA model, so Washington wants to align itself with that. Seattle will then be subsumed in the Washington State IRA if they're successful in the 2020 session. Again, it's managed by a state agency. A marketplace is exactly what you would think it would be. IRAs and 401ks approved by the state, available in the marketplace for individuals or businesses to take advantage of. The payroll deduction IRA in New York State is just a little bit different in the sense that it doesn't allow for auto enrollment. It's not mandatory, and there is no auto enrollment. So it's a plain vanilla payroll deduction IRA type, and that type of offering has been available for 40 years. Not a lot of employers have really taken advantage of it. New York State has not been very active in moving to implement this right now. In their last legislative session, they wanted to add auto enrollment. New York City is very aggressively looking to set up an auto IRA program. So again, the dynamic between New York City and what it does and what that means for the state, and ultimately will they converge in the same way that we see with Seattle and Washington is a possibility. So some early program planning considerations as North Carolina undertakes its studies. I think it's important that a task force thinks about some guiding principles that it may want to establish as it thinks about what type of model is going to work best for them. It's also important in terms of drafting legislative language to not be overly prescriptive. The reality and the lessons learned from states that have implemented programs is that you don't want to tie your hands. The board that is established, give it the discretion to make adjustments and have the flexibility. There's a lot that can be handled with details in administrative rulemaking. A perfect example of that is the default contribution rate. Early legislation had a 3% default contribution rate. Well, then, because it was in law at 3%, and we learned through research that workers were comfortable with something higher, they had to go back and amend the laws to increase the default contribution rate. There are things like that that administratively can just be handled and really should not. Leave it to the discretion of the board to set things like default contribution rates, have flexibility on investment options, and so on and so forth. The management model actually matters, and I think Andrea's going to talk a little bit more about this. But again, if you look at how this is done, I've said a lot of them rest with the treasurer. Treasurer often chairs the board. It doesn't have to be the treasurer, but an agency-based model, a connection to the state, carries some gravitas, carries some weight with the state and the employers and the workers throughout the state. There are other states that have a non-agency-based model. It's a little bit more challenging when it isn't sort of under that umbrella of the state to set up. Engage key stakeholders early and often. Many of you in this room are among those key stakeholders. So what I would say to legislators and others is please keep the business community and other key stakeholders, obviously AARP in North Carolina and many other organizations that care deeply about this, engage with them early and often and have that dialogue that's necessary as part of this work of a task force as you develop the legislation and move forward. And recognize early the importance of ongoing outreach and marketing to employers and employees. Communication is extremely important. You don't want to get too far down the track and then try to do that. It's always much harder. Again, engaging stakeholders, engaging the employers and employees, their stakeholders, bringing people into the process early and often, and providing them with information, having you all be involved is absolutely critical to success going forward. And just to let you know, you're not alone. And we're very happy to see states continuing to get ready in the pipeline. So, again, current studies underway. You're one of those states, along with Colorado, Idaho, Indiana, Wisconsin, New Mexico is continuing its work. We have several other states that have done task force reports. We're looking forward to the legislative sessions in 2020 and legislation moving forward. But again, as you can see right here, that we've got at least another 10 or more states. So we're very excited about the prospects in the short term for more states to be jumping into this and setting up these kinds of programs. What are some current trends and things to keep in mind? Again, more new state programs. We're going to be working hard with many others to hopefully make that happen and be a resource for you all as you think about that. The movement away from the marketplace to the auto IRA model. One of the other things is some of the states that haven't acted necessarily, and even some of the states that are in study mode, are small states. So an issue of getting to scale is a challenge. So when you look at states like Wyoming, Utah, Idaho, states that are sort of in the mountain state region, other states in the country that are tiny, Rhode Island, I've worked closely with Rhode Island, very tiny state, wants to do something. What we have put forward at the center in terms of sort of the notion of, as we have 529 college savings plans, the ABLE savings plans. ABLE savings plans have been very successful through multi-state arrangements to help get to scale and keep costs low. There's no reason why similar multi-state arrangements can't also exist in retirement savings, especially to help states that are smaller, perhaps join with other states to set up these kinds of programs. Multi-tier approach, there are states that are looking at IRAs as well as MEPs. They could set up a MEP type arrangement, but then also the default into an IRA if you don't choose to use a MEP. So there are different kinds of options that are available to states to consider and be innovative. And some of these task forces in the past have looked at that and recommended it. Again, I will say with all of this, because states have been taking this leadership role and shining a light on this issue, that private sector plan innovation is accelerating. But I think states will always fill an important gap. So there's a lot of great things, new companies, startups, fintechs, technology is allowing amazing things to happen. And the private sector is really stepping up to say, hey, okay, we get it. There's this access issue. We've got to help more people be covered. We're going to be more aggressive in developing products and taking them to small businesses. That's great. The states have always said, bring it. Because the goal for policymakers is always, okay, the policy problem to be solved. And if the private sector is part of that solution, that's great. States are also helping to put a greater focus on issues like the contingent workforce, the gig economy, financial well-being, again, things like financial education, emergency savings, addressing debt burdens. And again, really important, the importance of investment performance. The Treasurer talked a bit about that on the public sector side, public pensions. And we've done some research at Georgetown on that. And happy, if you go to our site, you can see what we're saying about target date funds and diversification of asset allocations in the same way that you have asset diversification in defined benefit pension plans. And lifetime income strategies, we've also done work on that and looking at a variety of solutions and options that are available so that we can start looking at having those become part of defined contribution plans. 9 ways that state programs, so if I leave you with anything, it's these takeaways. These programs can transform retirement, states leading the way. Millions of workers will be better prepared. Small businesses are going to be more competitive. Employees are going to be more mobile. You can assist gig workers. It'll benefit underserved populations. It'll reduce burdens on state and local governments. It'll be a model. You can be a model for other states to act. You'll inspire innovation. It has already done that in the private sector, and will create those opportunities for the private sector as well while helping workers at the same time. So again, thank you very much for the opportunity. Go North Carolina. We're counting on you to help be an innovator in solving the retirement security challenge.
Well, thank you all. I'm really excited to be here. I feel like I got teed up very nicely in a couple of different sessions, and so I really appreciate that, having the opportunity to be here and to share a little bit about what we're thinking about when we're talking about retirement savings from a behavioral science perspective. But before I really get there, I actually want to pick up a thread that's sort of come through in a couple of the presentations today, because I think it's worth sort of spending a little bit of time and thinking about it. On one hand, on several of the sessions that's come through, we've had this idea that people really want to save. Like, if we offer it, they're going to come. If we build this, they're going to be here. If this is something that people are really have the intention to be able to save. But on the other hand, we have this idea that only 5% of people have gone and opened an IRA for themselves. If you have access through your employer, you're 15% more likely to save. All of these statistics, and those things, I think, don't make a lot of sense. Why would we have those things together? People really want to save. They have access. Like we said, we can walk down the street, open an IRA. It's not that hard, right? So if we have access, if we have the ability to save and we have the intention to save, why aren't we saving? Because I think this is a really important question. We also talked about over the last 50 years, the savings rate's been between about 8% and about 10%. Hasn't really changed all that much. And so maybe the question is, actually people don't want to save. What if it was about 8%, 10%? Maybe that's about right. actually? Why do we need these kinds of programs if actually the problem is that people just don't really want to save? We offered a couple of reasons why people might be getting in the way of their savings. We talked a little bit about, maybe it's consumerism. Actually, people prefer to spend their money right now. That could be. We also talked a little bit, it's not just consumerism. Maybe it's, people have lack of income. They don't have the ability to save. I think that's probable too. There's a lot of things that can make it more difficult to save when we don't have that ability to save or put things away for the future when we're really trying to make ends meet in the near term. And it could also be that we just don't have this lack of access. We don't have the ability to. But as we mentioned, it could also be that people just don't want to save. So I think there's a fourth category that I really want to explore today, which answers this question a little bit about actually it is the people do want to save and they have the ability to save, but there are these other set of factors that make it more difficult or make it less likely that they will do so. And then, in fact, actually taking an initiative and making active steps can help align people's behaviors, their savings ability, with their intentions. So it makes it easier for them to sort of be able to engage in the kinds of behaviors that they would like to do. And that's really what we think about from a behavioral science perspective. It's saying people have an intention to save. How do we make it easier to align what they would like to do with what they're able to do? How do we take their behavior and align it with their intention? So at the Center for Advanced Hindsight, sorry, my slides got a little bit messed up there. But so from the Center for Advanced Hindsight, we're part of Duke University. We're a social science research center there. And really, we think about a lot of different issues. We're not just focused on long-term savings. We're thinking about how do we use behavioral science to make people happier, healthier, and wealthier from this behavioral science perspective. We do this in a lot of different ways. We think about it not just in health and money, but we're also thinking about what kinds of new ideas can we bring to the marketplace. And we're thinking about this both within the United States, but also internationally. So my question a little bit is, if we buy the idea that people do want to save, what have we done to encourage people to save for their retirement at this point? What are the ideas? Maybe we've increased interest rates. We've used some of our financial tools. But when we really think about it, the main thing that we've done up until this point over the last several decades, the primary instrument that we've used to encourage more retirement savings has been financial education. We've done this at the state level. We've done this at the federal level. We have a financial literacy and education commission that's sort of housed in the executive branch, thinking about how do we make sure that people understand that these concepts are really important. Financial institutions routinely offer this kinds of education. We're bringing people into the workplace. We're bringing people to other sorts of programs. We're really sort of bought into this idea that if only people understood how serious or how important these issues are, that might encourage them to save more. Unfortunately, we haven't also questioned whether or not this is the most effective strategy. And as you look, there was a really nice meta-analysis that was done by John Lynch and others who looked at it sort of across the board and had said, okay, looking at a bunch of these different financial education programs, do we see that they are actually successfully changing behavior? And what they found was that these sort of knowledge-based or content-based financial education classes only accounted for a tiny percentage of behavioral change. And in fact, actually, as we were mentioning earlier, and as Sarah mentioned in her speech, it was this idea that information alone is not sufficient to change behavior. It's an important component. People need to have this sort of baseline financial literacy, but providing more information, providing more education by itself is not a sufficient approach to changing behavior. So, leads us to this idea. There's this idea of an intention-action gap. People may understand very well, yes, this is important, and I would love to be able to save for retirement, and I have the ability to do so. But even in that scenario, we oftentimes have a situation where people fail to follow through on their intentions. And that this leads to this idea that even in the best case scenario, there are other factors that are preventing people from engaging in that kind of behavior. So I'm going to spend a little bit of today thinking about just a couple of those ideas. What are the main elements that are sort of making this idea of savings for retirement much more difficult? And as you all are thinking through, how do we design a program or what would be the best kinds of solution for North Carolinians, These are kind of the kinds of important considerations to take in place when you're thinking specifically about how to design those kinds of products or those kinds of services. What are the features we need to include? Because as Dr. Antonelli mentioned, there are lots of ways we could bake this cake. There's a lot of different approaches we could take. But the truth is there's a few essential elements that are going to be a part of each of these different recipes. And I want to highlight a couple of those from a psychological perspective. What are the essential elements that we need in order to have a successful retirement savings program here in North Carolina? So, the first is this idea of present bias. So present bias is this idea that we overly and unrealistically place a high value on the here and now. It's this idea that of all of our considerations, the things that are occurring right in the moment capture a greater portion of our attention. And I'm going to give you a quick example. So this was a study that was run, a very famous study, but it was this idea that if I brought to you today just a small box of chocolates, and I said, I'll give you this box of chocolates, it's free, it's all yours. If you want it today, I'll give you this box of chocolates. But if you would be willing to wait a week, I'll bring you a box of chocolates that's twice as big. And I would ask you, okay, which would you prefer? Would you like a smaller box of chocolates today or a much larger box of chocolates next week? And what we found, and what the researchers in this case found also, was that a majority of people actually took that smaller box of chocolates today. It's right in front of us. I'm a little bit hungry. It's about that time in the afternoon. I started thinking I missed the cake. That's a really bummer. I would take that small box of chocolates, and actually if I brought a box, a majority of us in this room would do so as well. But we also flipped that situation, and we asked a separate question. How about this day next year, I'll bring you a small box of chocolates and ask you, would you prefer me to bring you that in a year, or would I prefer to bring you a large box of chocolates in a year plus a week? Of course, at this point now everyone's like, well, I'm going to wait a year. Might as well just wait a little bit longer and get my double box of chocolates. That sounds great. But this is an interesting question because the time period is actually exactly the same, right? We have this weird sort of switch in preferences, depending if I'm asking which do you prefer right now versus which would you prefer at some point in the future. And it's this idea that really sort of highlights what we mean when we're talking about present bias. It's this idea that our preferences and what we intend and what we would like depend a little bit on what time frame we're talking about. Retirement savings, though, is a really tough one, right? Because we're thinking about way far off in the future for a lot of people. Not always the case, of course, but for a lot of people, we're thinking about things that are going to come to us and materialize perhaps 10 years, perhaps 20 years, maybe 30, 40 years down the line, things we can't even imagine. In that case, when we're thinking about what would I prefer, my preferences about things that are approaching me right now are going to be different than the things that I'm thinking about in the long term. And so it's this idea, the present bias is that I'm overly focused and I have a much higher preference for things that are happening right now. So one of the reasons why retirement savings is particularly difficult is we overvalue short-term spending and expenses that get at the expense of long-term savings. This was a theme, so we actually did some qualitative research with people in Oregon who would be eligible for the Oregon Saves program had they been when they would be offered, but we got to them before they were offered the program. So this people who are unexposed to the program, but we wanted to hear from them what were some of the reasons why you might not enroll. And probably the most common theme that came through is I'm already living sort of, paycheck to paycheck. It would just be really hard for me to find things to cut. What would I be doing? But then we offered them a chance what if you were able to enroll next year? Would that be something that was interesting? And a vast majority of people thought, next year I'll be in a much better spot. I'm going to be a lot more stable. Right now, things are really complicated. I'm really busy. I got this, school expense for my kid. But, next year I'm going to be in a much better position to be able to save. In reality, of course, if we asked them again next year, we went back to them now and I said, hey, would you be willing to save now? They'd be like, next year is still better. I don't know. It's this idea that the better version of ourselves is always tomorrow. And so the idea that we would much rather commit and to do things for ourselves, for our future selves, when we're given the option to do so. But if we're able to force to make the decision right now, we oftentimes, other things get in the way. So there's a flip side to this. If present bias is this idea that we overly value sort of things that are occurring right now, There's a flip side to that, and that is this idea of hyperbolic discounting. I know it's a big word, but really what we're thinking about here is we put an unrealistically low and inconsistent value on the long term. Now, this is really problematic, right? Because now not only are we overvaluing things that are happening right now, we're undervaluing things that are happening way down the line. These things are at complete odds when we're thinking about retirement savings. So we have this double-sided problem where not only are short-term expenses really getting in the way, but long-term savings just really aren't that appealing. We oftentimes think about it along in this sort of four-component sort of a quadrant. If you could put anything into this, you can put any kind of behavior into this, and thinking about what are the benefits to us. You have two scales. One scale is when is the benefit going to arrive? It could arrive tomorrow, really short term, could arrive immediately, or it can be arriving really long term, way down the line, things we may not even be thinking about. And then the other scale is the benefit functional or is it hedonic? Is it something that's just like, yeah, this is a really good thing to do. It's not like exactly all that exciting, but I know it's really important, so that's great. And then there's other that's like, oh man, I really enjoy it. It brings me a lot of pleasure. And that's the hedonic scale, functional versus hedonic. And so let's just think about exercise as a potential behavior. What can we do in order to get people there, right? Well, there's two different kinds. One, short-term or long-term, long-term and functional would be this idea of improved heart health. I know it's in the wrong quadrant. So that's something that's gonna come over the much longer period of time. It's not that exciting, but it's important. The short-term hedonic would be this idea of I enjoy going to the gym with my friends. It's something we do as a group. It's something that's pleasurable. I go, we have a good time, and then I leave, and then it's over. So it's a short-term hedonic pleasure versus this longer-term functional value. If I asked you which would be more motivating to go to the gym today, most people would not tell you that it's improved heart health. The truth is, even though we know that that's probably the right answer, when we actually try to convince someone to go to the gym today, and I could tell you, hey, go to the gym today, it's gonna make your heart health better in 30 years. Or if I say, hey, go to the gym today, all of your friends are already there, you're missing out. I'll tell you that is the much more motivating factor. And when we think about retirement savings, we're really in a problem. Because retirement savings is almost exclusively, all of the benefits are almost exclusively in the quadrant of long-term functional. Is this idea that all of the benefits that are coming to us are things that we know are important, but they're just not all that exciting. And they're coming to us in decades from now. And there's two reasons why that the benefits of retirement savings are just not that exciting. One, as I mentioned, long-term. It's coming way down the line, it's hard to imagine. And the other thing is that they're just abstract. Think about if I asked you, what does financial well-being mean to you in 40 years? It's a really hard thing to describe. It's not something that we have oh yeah, it means that I get to be able to go out to dinner with my wife. It means that I'd be able to take a vacation every year. It means that I'm not stressed about my finances. I can tell you all of those things, but it's really hard to connect with ourselves in the future. There's a really nice research study that was done by a guy named Hal Hirschfield. And what he did was he actually looked at this connection between ourselves right now and ourselves in the future. And he actually had this cool technological device that was able to age your face. It was able to say okay, it was a slider and it showed you this this is you now and then this is you in 10, 20, 30 years. And what he found was just being able to show that transition over time made retirement savings a little bit more motivating. People were more willing to start saving for retirement savings. And what that really is getting at is this idea that we're really disconnected from ourselves in the future. And that there's this discontinuity between who we are now and who we are in the future. As we get older, of course, we become more connected to that person. But if you ask who's myself in 50 years, that person actually, from a psychological perspective, is kind of like a stranger. It's not someone we recognize. We don't know what they do on a day-to-day basis. We don't know what they care about. It actually kind of feels a little bit like a stranger. And you think about what is retirement savings then? It means you're just putting away money for a stranger. Would you every month give $500 to a stranger with no connection to that person? It's an interesting question to ask, but it means that just the idea of retirement savings without additional supports is just not that motivating to begin with. And the third reason that I'm going to mention right here is this idea of opportunity cost neglect. And it's this idea that when we are making decisions regarding money, we have a really hard time deciding what are we giving up when we make that decision. Is one of the reasons that makes money really complex to deal with. And actually, when you think about this, is also the flip side of this is what makes money really important. What makes money probably one of the greatest inventions in human history is the idea that money is this go-between between all of the things that we want. So, back in the days when we were a sort of a barter economy, this idea like we'd have to come together, we'd have to say, okay, I've got this good, maybe it's worth a couple of chickens, I've got this and that. We'd have to figure out what the translation cost was and what the exchange rate between these random goods would be. Money allows us to sort of have this go-between one good and the other, and it allows us to be able to translate all of these different goods and experiences into one another. It makes things a lot easier for us to navigate in a very complicated economy. And as we heard, our economy is becoming more and more complex. And so not only is money really important for us to be able to navigate goods from one thing to another, it's allowing us to translate across different time periods as well. And so money has this amazing quality of allowing us to connect multiple goods, but that's really hard to do. And so, before I came over here, I went to Starbucks, I bought like a $3 coffee, and I said, it didn't occur to me that this was something that I might be giving up. What is a $3 coffee actually worth? I mean, for me, maybe not that much. But in the reality is that actually that $3 coffee, if I didn't spend that $3 there, it's not like then I get $3 somewhere else. Maybe if I put that $3 into a retirement account, it becomes, $100 with compounding interest after $20 or after 20 years. But that's just not something I think about. Or maybe it's like, okay, if I spent an extra $100 on clothing this month, but I forget, if I had not done that, then maybe it's like a couple of weeks extra vacation in like 10 years. These kinds of translation things are just really complicated and not things we think about. So this idea of like, what are we giving up when we use money, these opportunity costs, it's just not something that's easy for us to do, and we oftentimes just ignore them. And instead, we rely on our kinds of rules of thumb or heuristics or habits in order to make these decisions a lot easier for us. I'll give you another example. So imagine that after today, we were all going home, and we go and we will stop by, a little store, and we need to buy a new pen. So really, we want a nice pen, but it's $15, and we say, okay, sounds good. I need a new pen. And you walk up and you go to purchase it, and you're getting your wallet out or whatever. And the woman behind the desk sits there and says, you know what? You seem like a nice guy. I'll tell you what. We have a sister store that's like 5 blocks away. They have this exact same pen, but it's actually just $7. How many of us would walk 5 blocks for a $7 pen versus a $50? Got a few people here. Yeah, look at all you guys, smart people, right? Of course you would. It's more than half off. That's a great deal. I like this pen. It's only $7. That's fantastic. It also, my heart is healthier in 30 years. It's great. This is perfect. Okay. Great. Let's imagine a slightly different scenario. Let's imagine that instead of it's a pen, this weekend we actually go to a store and we're going to buy a new TV. And the TV is $1,000 and $15. And it's like, man, it's one of those curved TVs. It's really nice. I'm like super excited about it. So I get invested and I've decided this is the TV I'm going to buy. I go to the store and the guy behind the counter says, you know what? You seem like a really nice guy. I'll tell you what. We got a sister store 4 blocks away. And they're selling the same TV, but it's not that, it's $1,000 and $7. It's a great deal. How many of us are walking 4 blocks to get $8 off a $1,000 TV? A few people are like, yeah, that's a really good deal. I'm definitely going to do it. Also, my heart is healthier in 30 years. But the truth of the matter is it changes, right? It feels a little bit like, I know it's the right decision to do, but I also kind of feel like I'm being a little stingy. Like, it's what is $8 when I'm already spending $1,000? Versus the pen, you're like, man, that's like that's more than half off. That's definitely like I should not buy a $15 pen. That would be outrageous. Like I actually feel like I'm splurging a little bit. It's this idea of relativity. Like our decisions, our financial decisions are actually guided a little bit by the context, right? The price of the item I'm buying changes the way that I think about the value of that good. The same sort of idea is in place when we're thinking about retirement savings. The context or the value that we're making those decisions changes the way that we value our long-term savings. And so we poorly understand the effect of our current spending on our long-term savings. It's this idea that when I'm making a decision about what I'm doing now, how I'm using my resources in the current time frame, actually, we don't really think about how much that's affecting our long term. We have a bad understanding that actually compound interest allows us to sort of to turn current consumption into greater and sort of longer, much greater consumption down the line. We don't understand that connection, or we have a bad understanding of how that works. And so we rely on sort of our tools, our rules of thumb, our heuristics, in order to make that translation easier. But the problem is that those rules of thumb and heuristics are biased. They're not perfectly accurate. And so the truth is, when we're trying to make these decisions, these very complex decisions about how should I use my money and when, we're using tools and tricks of our mind that are not perfectly accurate. And for that reason, we're actually making suboptimal or bad financial decisions. And I don't want this to be pejorative in any way. I'm not trying to say, wow, people are really stupid. If only they knew better, like, wouldn't that be great? The truth is, it's actually coming from a greater respect for people's current circumstances. It's coming at it from, you know what, I'm gonna design policies, I'm gonna design products from an understanding of what your life is actually like. Because if I thought that, like, you know what, if people were just stupid, I could just give you financial education and that would work. And I wish we lived in that world, but we don't. The truth is, we live in a world in which people need support. They need guidance, and they need different kinds of tools at their disposal in order to make better financial decisions. So a little bit of implications is to just recognize that people are unlikely to save on their own. Because when we're thinking about, you know, should we help people to save retirement? Essentially, that's what we're asking, right? Should we help people to make this decision a little bit easier? We oftentimes think about people in this situation. Just someone standing around the world thinking about, should I start saving for my retirement? I don't think this is really actually representative of people's worlds, right? People don't have that kind of time, because the reality is when people are thinking this decision, it looks a little bit more like this. We have all kinds of things in the world that are sort of vying for our attention, that are vying for our money, that are vying for, you know, the kinds of things that we think are important, that are memory. And it makes it a lot harder to focus on things that are important. And so one of the ways that has been mentioned that have sort of helped in this world is this idea of auto-enrollment and sort of getting people automatically to start saving. And I just want to sort of show how important that's been. This was from a study that was done in The Economist, and this was looking at changes in auto-enrollment and savings population and the amount of savers from 2006 into 2010. And you can see this is the percentage of large companies on the left that are automatically enrolling their employees into a 401k account every year. It's jumping up a little bit, moving on towards 60%. That has continued since 2010 and gotten even larger. And you can see the number of participants who are saving for retirement in that same period consistently correlating, going up as well. And so you see it started about 60 million and has moved up from there. But there's another side to this story. And this was a really important point that just got mentioned just a second ago about default contribution rates. Because as you were thinking about, well, should it be 3%? Maybe 3% will get more people into the plan. Well, maybe 5% is better off. Maybe 8% even. What if we went that high? Maybe that would suppress people's ability to join. But what if we went really low and we just gave them the option to change, right? That would be the ideal solution. Start really low, and if they can save a little bit more, they will. But there's a really important sort of second, or I guess in this case, a third aspect of the story, which is this idea that people respond to a default in a really powerful way. So auto-enrollment has certainly increased the number of people who are savings for retirement, but unfortunately that has also decreased the average savings rate over this period of time. And why is that? Because as we said, we thought the right default rate was 3%. Or 5%. And we started off low because we were really worried about scaring people off. But the problem is someone who could have saved 5 or 6, 7, maybe even 8%, they were like, well, the default was 3%. I guess that's what I should do. We follow the default because there's a couple of reasons why defaults are really powerful, but they're really powerful. And so when we're thinking about what are the design principles that I want to include when I'm thinking about what is the right retirement solution for North Carolinians, these things really matter. I don't want to sort of lay in and make this super important and make it sort of I can't make a decision, so I'm not going to do anything at all. Doing something in this case is really important, but thinking about the details of that specific solution are really important. 3% is too small. Not only are people not going to be saving, people can save more than that, But what are the other kinds of details across that that are also really important? Because these things are actually going to sort of influence the future success of whatever solution we end up doing.